Halt! Who comes?
Forlorn Hope.
Advance the forlorn and be recognised.
The Forlorn Hope, brave lads who volunteered for near-suicidal missions, such as the first into the breach of a siege. Their name is mainly synonymous with the Napoleonic Wars. But what is the history of the Forlorn Hope? Who were they? How did armies find enough volunteers for such deadly missions? Listen folks, today is a brutal tale of exceptional bravery. If you're of a delicate disposition, perhaps you should click away now. Anyway, let's start off with the obvious question. Where did the name Forlorn Hope come from? Well, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term Forlorn Hope dates back to the 16th century. It derives from the Dutch Verloren Hoop, meaning lost heap or lost troop. The British adopted this into the similarly sounding Forlorn Hope. The French had their own name, Les Enfants Perdus, the lost children. By the way, this video will be chock full of quotes from eyewitnesses and Forlorn Hope survivors. For those who are interested, I'll put a reading list in the description below, so check that out. Now, since ancient times there's been a version of the Forlorn Hope in combat. They've generally served two main functions. The first was to act as a rear guard during a retreat, sacrificing themselves so that their mates could live to fight another day. Most famous is the last stand at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. Yep, thanks to Hollywood, you've probably heard of that one.
This is Sparta!
When the allied Greek armies were forced to withdraw, King Leonidas of Sparta offered to lead the rearguard of Spartans, Thespians and Thebans, an ancient Forlorn Hope if you will. They willingly stood to the last man, their sacrifice contributing to Greece's eventual victory over the Persian Empire. Examples of another ancient Forlorn Hope come to us from the Roman Empire. When the legions laid siege, they offered a gold crown called the Corona Moralis or mural crown. This was presented to the first soldier onto the enemy ramparts who survived. The vetting process was extremely high, especially when there could be multiple claimants. During one particular siege, Julius Caesar's naval and land forces each claimed their candidate should be awarded the crown. Since it was impossible to tell who had actually been first onto the battlements, Caesar awarded it to both men. Countless examples exist across antiquity and the Middle Ages of soldiers heroically leading assaults or sacrificing themselves in a desperate last stand. During the English Civil War, not long after the term Forlorn Hope came into usage, both sides employed them as advance and rear guards. Rather than seeking volunteers in those days though, they were selected by lot. But for now, let's focus on the Napoleonic era, which I guess you could say is the heyday of the Forlorn Hope. Assaulting fortified strongholds has always been, let's face it, a nightmare. But as technology has developed, it got harder. During the Renaissance, bastion or star forts were developed. Outer entrenchments had an artificial slope called a glacis, meaning that it could deflect cannonballs aimed at the wall's base. The walls themselves were also made thicker, their height reduced to make cannon breaches more difficult. You could ask, I suppose, well, don't shorter walls make ladder assaults easier, aka escalades? Well, this was addressed by the construction of bastions, which were protruding battlements on the corners and along the curtain wall. Now, any attacker could be subjected to enfilade fire on multiple sides, not a good position to be in. Concentrating enough firepower to breach the wall was time-consuming for the besieging force and expended vast amounts of ammunition. On top of that, it announced to the defenders exactly where you were coming. Prolonged sieges to starve the enemy out were not always practical. This was especially true for the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army during, yep, you've got it, the Peninsular War, one of the most interesting campaigns in British military history and one we've covered at length on this channel. Wellington's army was small, rarely above 50,000 soldiers in the field. The French, under a string of Napoleon's best marshals, including Michel Ney, Nicolas Soult, André Massena and Auguste de Marmont, had roughly 5 times as many troops spread out across the Iberian Peninsula. Guerrilla fighters and what was left of the Spanish army were all that kept the French from massing against Wellington. The French obviously couldn't be everywhere all at once, and if they could combine to meet Wellington, he was in big trouble, and he knew it. This meant Wellington, when he moved, could not do it slowly. He was like a boxer who needed to be on his toes, flicking out jabs at a stronger opponent. As you can see, boxing is one of my favourite sports. As the Allies pushed through Portugal and Spain, enemy strongholds had to fall quickly. Most infamous of all was the Third Siege of Badajoz in April 1812. Wellington had just captured the other border city of Ciudad Rodrigo in January. This siege lasted 3 weeks and fell after a brutal assault.
Rodrigo is taken!
However, nothing could have prepared the Anglo-Portuguese army for the hell they were about to face. Badajoz's defences were higher, its walls thick. The river and rough terrain severely limited avenues of approach. What's more, the French knew they were coming. The surrounding moat and glacis were covered in buried mines and spike traps. Adding to Wellington's need for haste, Marshal Soult was on his way to relieve Badajoz with another army. The city had to fall quickly lest the Anglo-Portuguese became trapped between two French forces. Over the next 3 weeks, a pair of breaches were blasted into the walls. These were smaller than Wellington had hoped. But with Soult's approach imminent, he was running out of time. He had to act. They would storm the breaches and the Badajoz castle. A forlorn hope would secure footholds for the first wave.
The Forlorn Hope are dead men, the hour their names are called. First up the wall of the breach, first to die, blown apart by mine or cannon.
A typical Forlorn Hope of the era consisted of between 100 and 200 men, all volunteers. It was generally led by an officer. These were mostly young subalterns, many simply not rich enough to purchase their way up the promotion ladder. And promotion was often the reward for officers leading the Forlorn Hope. One example is Lieutenant Colin Campbell of the 9th Royal Norfolk Regiment. He was just 20 years old when he led the Forlorn Hope during the storming of San Sebastian in 1813. Twice wounded, he survived and was promoted to captain 3 months later. Campbell would of course go on to serve in the Crimea, was later appointed Commander-in-Chief of British forces in India and retired as a Field Marshal. Not a bad career. But anyway, let's not get ahead of ourselves and let's return to the siege of Badajoz. In addition to the appointed officer commanding, several NCOs, including at least one sergeant, maintained order and kept the men from panicking. Like their officer counterparts, the best NCOs led by example, often at the cost of their own lives. According to Peter Snow's excellent work To War with Wellington, link in the description below, quote, "The few score of men at the spearhead of each storming party faced a high chance of death or dismemberment. Survival could lead to fast promotion, but the risks were high." Motives amongst the enlisted volunteers were as varied as the men themselves. Like the officers, some were keen for promotion or for the prestige of having been involved. For example, some regiments allowed members of the Forlorn Hope to wear a badge on their right arm, which would be a laurel wreath with the letters V and S at the centre, signifying them as a valiant stormer. Now, according to Richard Holmes's fantastic history Redcoat, men were so eager to join the Forlorn Hope that they would offer already selected comrades as much as £20 to take their place. That was a hell of a lot of money in those days. Now, on the 5th of April, Wellington made ready to storm Badajoz. Of the 20,000 soldiers besieging the city, around 200 were assigned to the Forlorn Hopes, attacking the breaches at Santa Maria and Trinidad. These breaches were assigned to the Light and 4th Divisions under Major Generals Charles Alton and Lowry Cole respectively. A third assault, led by Major General Sir Thomas Picton's 3rd Division, was tasked with storming the castle. Now, the castle walls were taller and there were no breaches blown in it. Therefore, this was meant to be little more than a diversion. I think you might see where this is going, but anyway, let's crack on. However, at the last minute, Wellington ordered the attack halted for a single day with the hope of blowing a 3rd breach. This was only partially achieved with the San Vicente bastion assigned to Major General James Leith's 5th Division. The rescheduled attack would take place at night. There was only moon and starlight to see by. Thousands of soldiers trampling about in total darkness risked getting completely lost. I get lost just walking down my street. Anyway, Wellington, being a sensible chap, mitigated this by assigning guides to lead the Forlorn Hopes and the subsequent waves to their respective breaches. We saw this at the beginning with Richard Sharp acting as a guide to the Forlorn Hope of the Santa Maria breach. Now, friend of the show James Mace, who researched and co-wrote this episode, has a similar scene in his novel, Forlorn Hope, The Storming of Badajoz.
Those who've read my Napoleonic novels, Forlorn Hope and I Stood with Wellington, likely noticed the brief, unnamed cameos Richard Sharp has in both works. Only in Forlorn Hope, he does not go into the breach and take Badajoz by himself. The officer he guides to the breach gives his name in Sharp's company as Benedict. His historical counterpart in Peter Snow's excellent work To War with Wellington is named Lieutenant Harvest, but his first name isn't given. I simply took both characters and merged them together because we're talking about the same person.
I'll link to James's author pages on Amazon and Amazon UK below. Anyway, Back to today's story, and at 10 p.m. on the 6th of April, Wellington ordered the assault on Badajoz. The surrounding entrenchments were deep with a steep precipice. Soldiers carried both ladders and large sacks filled with grass or straw. The one benefit to attacking at night was at least the French would also struggle to see the assault force. However, there was little surprise to be had. Once the first gallant band was spotted, an alarm sounded across the city, and all hell broke loose. Attackers leapt into the entrenchments, which they were horrified to learn were flooded. Some men even drowned. The steep climb up the glacis was full of partially buried spike traps, which impaled men through the hands and legs. Horrific, isn't it? The fuses of mines buried in front of the breaches were lit, followed by deafening explosions and a cacophony of musketry from all sides. Officers and NCOs, of course, were prime targets, and any not killed or maimed outright struggled to lead their men through this storm of death. Defenders were well protected by the ramparts. The Forlorn Hopes were exposed and in the open. Yet, these weren't normal men. On they pressed, their bodies numb. Once in the breach, the survivors took cover and returned fire as best they could. Now they needed to hold long enough not to be wiped out by a French counterattack. Luckily, they weren't alone for long. So a quick break for some housekeeping, guys. If you want to sign up for my mailing list, get your monthly newsletter and a free copy of my ebook all about the Battle of Isandlwana, then please go over to redcoathistory.com/newsletter, fill out your details, and I'll send those over. Alternatively, you can join my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/redcoathistory. For $5 a month, you'll get early access to all of my films and podcasts, and you can join the debates that we have over there. The first waves followed, with thousands coming to support the brave few clinging to the breaches by a thread. But these initial attacks proved futile. The French had had time to reinforce the breaches with much hated obstacles called chevaux de frise. These consisted of planks with crossed sword blades or spikes protruding from them, nasty things. They completely blocked the breaches. Behind this was a secondary waist-high wall from which the defenders fired into the breach. It didn't look good. The soldiers in the first wave of the Light and 4th Divisions failed to penetrate any deeper than the Forlorn Hope had already done. And the 5th Division's ladder teams became completely lost, delaying their attack on the San Vicente bastion. Let's go back to Peter Snow again. He says, "The desperate struggle went on in the dark. It was a scene of unimaginable slaughter. No night of the entire Peninsular War would be as bloody as this. Again and again, waves of British soldiers threw themselves into the breaches, only to be gunned down or skewered on the hideous obstructions studded with spikes and sword blades." But there was still Sir Thomas Picton's diversionary attack on the castle. You see where this is going, don't you? The assault was led by Lieutenant William Mackey of the 88th Connaught Rangers, a regiment that really distinguished themselves in the war. In fact, Picton hated them, referring to them as the Connaught Robbers. Mackey had already survived leading a Forlorn Hope at Ciudad Rodrigo, yet had been denied any good recognition. As they made ready to attack the castle, he demanded the chance to lead the assault. Picton consented. Despite his contemptuous feelings for many of his soldiers, Sir Thomas Picton was known for leading by example. He was among the first onto the ladders when a musket ball ricocheted off the ground and struck him in the groin. He fell from the ladder in a daze. However, this didn't stop him, and he soon rejoined the attack, hard as nails in those days. Lieutenant Mackey, meanwhile, had reached the top of the ladder. The French garrison commander, Armand Philippon, did not consider the castle assault a real threat and left only a small force to counter Picton. This small force was quickly overwhelmed. At the British camp, Wellington was unaware of Picton's success. Every report brought news of disaster. The attacks had failed. Neither breach could be secured, nor could the 5th Division get over the San Vicente bastion. Wellington considered ordering a retreat when an astounding sight caught everyone's attention. Another officer with the 3rd Division, Lieutenant James Macpherson of the 45th Nottinghamshires, had just survived being shot in the chest where a musket ball struck a Spanish dollar in his breast pocket. Dusting himself off, he removed his tunic and ran it up the flagpole of the castle. One of Picton's aides finally reached Wellington, informing him that the castle had fallen. Wellington ordered a final assault. Picton's soldiers surged forth from the castle, hitting the defences in the flanks. Relief washed over the bloody and beleaguered forces in the breaches. The remnants of the respective Forlorn Hopes led the final push through the chevaux de frise and into the city. According to Snow, when next Lieutenant Mackey saw General Picton, he said, "Are we still the Connaught Robbers, sir?" To which Picton replied, "No, you're now the Connaught Heroes." The fortress had fallen, but at a terrible cost. During the assault, the Allies suffered around 4,800 killed and wounded, 18% of their entire force, and triple their losses at Ciudad Rodrigo just a short while earlier. Even the ever-stoic Wellington was so distraught he openly wept at the sight of so many dead and maimed in the breaches.
It's time to go mad.
Regrettably, we cannot discuss the undaunting bravery and sacrifice of those lads without addressing the horrific aftermath, which saw British and Portuguese soldiers run amok, looting and killing. Now, I've made a film about that before, which you can watch on my Peninsular War playlist, so check that out. So what became of those gallant few? Not just those from Badajoz, but from every forlorn hoper who miraculously survived. After the smoke cleared, rewards were doled out to the survivors. Donations were paid to the enlisted ranks, and officers usually found themselves on the fast track to promotion. Though, as we saw with William Mackey, that wasn't always a guarantee. Sometimes politics and other things could get involved. NCOs or privates who distinguished themselves might be handed chevrons of the next higher rank, cut from the bloody tunic of a fallen comrade lying in the breach. As we mentioned earlier, the survivors received a Valiant Stormer badge. Now, if you've never seen this badge, that's hardly surprising. Given fatality rates, few were ever awarded. For example, only 19 of the 200 from the Forlorn Hope at Fort San Cristobal in 1811 survived. One of those was Private William Wheeler of the 51st. He wrote many letters detailing his experiences during the Napoleonic Wars. Cracking read. One recalls the exploits of Ensign Joseph Dias, who he described as a young officer of great promise, of a most excellent disposition, and beloved by every man in the corps, an Irishman whose only fortune was his sword. He said of Dias during the assault, "He was without his cap, his sword was shot off close to the handle, the sword scabbard was gone, and the laps of his frock coat were perforated with balls." This was Dias's first of two Forlorn Hopes, both of which he survived. Wheeler was wounded during the first abortive sortie and nearly captured. The French stole his clothes. He was left for dead, but he sprang up and, despite his injuries, ran stark naked all the way back to friendly lines while being cheered by his comrades. What a man. Wheeler's letters were later compiled into a book form, which is a fascinating read. I really enjoyed it. Another interesting Forlorn Hope survivor I've read a lot about is John Shipp. He was a sergeant who led multiple, though unsuccessful, attacks during the siege of Bharatpur in India in 1805. So impressed was General Lake that he awarded him a commission and helped him financially. His is a great story and one I've also covered on the channel before. I think I should do it again because that was a few years ago. Anyway, moving on, and the term Forlorn Hope seems to have died off in the British Army after the Napoleonic Wars. I haven't found any mentions of its use in the Crimea. If you've found other mentions of it, please do comment below. It did, however, find a brief resurgence across the Atlantic during the American Civil War. The book Deeds of Valor by W.F. Bayer and Oscar Keedle makes several mentions of Forlorn Hopes. One example was from the Siege of Vicksburg in 1863. Quote, "At 10 a.m. these men raced out from behind their entrenchments, where they were almost immediately shrouded in enemy smoke and rifle fire. Logs, ladders and planks dropped by the wayside as men were killed and wounded. Somehow Private Howell G. Trogdon, carrying a flag of the storming party, planted it on the stockade Redan's parapet, marking the location for the assault. For his extreme gallantry, Trogdon was awarded the Medal of Honor, of course the American equivalent to the Victoria Cross." I asked my friend James Mace if he'd ever heard the term used during his own time in the armed forces.
I never heard the term Forlorn Hope used in a contemporary sense. That's not to say that near-suicidal assaults into a critical strongpoint don't happen, or heroic last stands to save the lives of one's friends. These are more spontaneous acts of self-sacrifice rather than something that's pre-written into the operations order.
One such example of spontaneous self-sacrifice came during the opening days of the First World War. Sidney Godley was a private with C Company 4th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers at the Battle of Mons. He volunteered to stay behind as the rest of his unit withdrew under heavy fire.
Someone's got to stay to the end, sir.
Sid Godley possessed a reputation for being utterly unflappable. The badly injured Corporal Palmerton later recounted, "With glorious courage, Godley scrambled towards the emplacement and under heavy fire brought the right gun into action again." Godley became a one-man Forlorn Hope. He held Nemi Bridge against repeated assaults for another 2 hours before being very badly wounded. He was captured by the Germans, but was awarded the Victoria Cross for his incredible bravery. Though Godley never spoke of the war except to those who were there, Nemi Bridge never truly left him. Years later, he visited the cemetery at St. Semaphorian, I think that's how you say it, near Mons. Upon seeing the grave of Maurice Dees, he tearfully told his daughter Eileen, "That's where I should be lying with my comrades." So, while the term Forlorn Hope has fallen into disuse, the act of soldiers making the ultimate self-sacrifice remains eternal. Though some men, such as Sid Godley, are recognised for their selfless bravery, many remain forgotten by all except those who owe them their lives. This video is dedicated to all of those brave but forgotten men throughout history who laid down their lives to save their mates.